In March 2021, a single container ship ran aground and blocked the Suez Canal for just 6 days. That brief accident froze nearly 12% of all global trade, creating a backlog of hundreds of ships and halting billions in daily commerce. If a 6-day traffic jam can send shockwaves through the global supply chain, imagine the damage caused by two superpowers intentionally attempting to strangle each other's economies for years. In military strategy, a direct conflict involving missile strikes, naval battles, and invasions is often called Plan A. But when a quick victory proves impossible, nations frequently turn to Plan B, economic warfare and maritime blockades. On paper, a blockade sounds appealing. Instead of risking troops in a direct assault, you park your navy outside an adversary's trade routes, cut off their vital resources, and wait for them to surrender. It is often pitched to politicians as a bloodless, low-risk alternative to combat. But history shows that blockades are rarely safe or predictable. They are highly volatile campaigns governed by a set of unbreakable strategic iron laws that dictate exactly how a prolonged economic war will unfold. The first iron law states that a successful blockade requires two things: an adversary heavily reliant on outside resources, and a blockading force capable of controlling the geographic choke points those resources flow through. We see this as far back as the Peloponnesian War in 425 BCE. The Athenian navy trapped hundreds of Spartan soldiers on the island of Sphacteria. By cutting off their food supply from the sea, Athens used geographic isolation to force a stubborn enemy to the negotiating table. This map shows the major maritime trade routes. For China, which relies heavily on imported oil, these routes are a strategic vulnerability. A closer look reveals the Malacca dilemma. Imported energy must squeeze through narrow straits. Controlling these passages turns off the tap, so the geography is perfectly set up for an economic trap. But as the next iron laws reveal, springing that trap immediately triggers a cascade of unintended consequences for the blockading nation. This brings us to the second iron law. Blockades have a steep cost, and it's usually paid by the blockading power's allies. Shutting down global trade routes causes immediate price shocks and widespread supply shortages that hurt neutral nations just as much as the target. To make matters worse, the third iron law dictates that targeted nations do not passively accept economic ruin. They actively adapt, finding creative ways to substitute resources and bypass the trap. In a modern conflict, a targeted nation would immediately mask the movements of its oil tankers by spoofing their automatic tracking data. They could hire private security contractors or use massive commercial fishing fleets to escort cargo ships, making it incredibly difficult for a blockading navy to isolate specific targets without firing shots. They can also rely on their domestic industrial capacity. As the world's largest producer of commercial ships, China has the massive shipyard infrastructure required to rapidly build new tankers, replace any vessels lost to the blockade, and physically overwhelm a naval cordon. Because the adversary adapts so quickly, the blockade loses its appeal as a clean, bloodless strategy. The blockading coalition is forced to absorb severe economic pain at home, while waiting for military results that may take years to materialize. The pressure of that slow economic squeeze leads directly to the fourth iron law. Blockades predictably force targeted nations to abandon conventional tactics in favor of desperate, high-risk military escalations. During World War I, the British naval blockade caused severe supply shortages in Germany. In response, German decision-makers adopted a highly risky strategy: unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking civilian and neutral merchant ships in the Atlantic, which eventually drew the United States into the conflict. We saw it again before World War II. When the United States enacted an oil and resource embargo against Japan, the Japanese military felt economically isolated and strategically cornered. That pressure culminated in a massive escalation with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. If you apply this historical pattern to a modern conflict between superpowers, the implications are severe. If a blockade threatens the survival of a targeted regime, that government is highly likely to retaliate with extreme measures, potentially involving long-range missile strikes or nuclear escalation. This brings us to the fifth and final iron law. Economic pressure translates into battlefield advantage incredibly slowly. Rather than providing a quick victory, blockades turn rapid military operations into grueling, multi-year wars of attrition. So while a blockade is often proposed as a measured alternative to prevent total war, history tells us that economic strangulation is often the exact catalyst that ignites it. Even when the fighting eventually stops, the effects of a blockade linger. The conflict forces highly integrated global supply chains to sever completely and migrate away from the blockaded region. This geographic shift shatters the interconnected global economy we rely on today. Nations build redundant, walled-off resource spheres, leading to permanent international resource hoarding and a complete halt to cross-border trade. Plan B is never a clean, isolated alternative to combat. Implementing a blockade ensures that even if a coalition achieves its military objectives, the entire globe pays a permanent economic price long after the war ends.